Welcome to Radical AI, a podcast about radical ideas, radical people, and radical stories at the intersection of ethics and artificial intelligence. We are your hosts, Dylan and Jess. In this episode, we interview Dr. Eric Rice. Eric is an associate professor and the founding co-director of the USC Center for Artificial Intelligence in Society, a joint venture of the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work and the USC Viterbi School of Engineering. Rice received a BA from the University of Chicago and an MA and PhD in sociology from Stanford University. Eric's research focuses on community outreach, network science, and the use of social networking technology by high-risk youth.
A few of the big picture questions we cover in this interview include: how can social work utilize AI to address social injustice? How do we define social good? And then how do we design technology to uplift that social good? Where is the limit in the use of technology to solve societal problems, among others? It was our pleasure to have this conversation with Dr. Eric Rice, and now it is our pleasure to share this conversation with all of you. All right, well, we have on the line today Eric Rice. Eric, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks, Dylan. Thanks, Jess.
Absolutely. It's great to have you here. And I was wondering, before we get into more of the specifics of your research and the exciting projects that you're a part of right now, if you could tell us a little bit about how you've arrived here in the work that you're doing and a bit about what motivates you as either a researcher or just as a person doing the work you are doing.
I don't have a very linear academic trajectory. I mean, I think some people finish college and then they go to graduate school and they know exactly what they want to do and they go and become a professor doing that. And I got to AI via a winding route. It was not, to be honest, I didn't know that I was doing AI research when I was first doing AI research. I thought that I was doing interesting mathematical modeling with a computer scientist. And then he told me that, we were going to go present this at an AI conference. And I thought, I don't even know what AI means. What are you talking about? And then it turns out he's, this is Milland. It turns out he's, one of the, sort of big deal guys in AI, right? And really the, probably one of the biggest deal guys in the AI for social good arena from the computer science side. And as he and I became friends and got into this work, I have subsequently become somebody who does AI research and actually knows that I'm doing AI research. But I was originally trained as a sociologist. I was a math nerd when I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago. I started my first semester thinking that I was going to be a math major, and then I ended up falling in love with social theory, and so I became a sociologist and took a lot of math classes along the way as electives. Some people take art history. I took math as my college electives because I thought that they were fun classes, which has held me in good stead as a sociology trained person who is a social work faculty member. I'm in a school of social work at USC in the Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work, and I've been in social work now for more than a decade. So it's been, I started in 2009 at the School of Social Work, and I finished my PhD in 2002. And in between there, I had a little stint at UCLA where I was a non-tenure track researcher in a community health research center, which is really where I started to get involved in the work that inspires me, which is the work that I do with homeless adolescents. And what happened was when I finished my PhD program, I was a theoretical sociologist. I did a lot of very axiomatic stuff that's very akin to microeconomics is really what it is. And we did experimental studies, and I really thought, wow, there's 6 people are going to read this stuff in the future, and 3 of them are going to automatically like it because I'm on their theory camp, and 3 of them are going to hate it because I'm not. And what am I doing with my life? And I reached out through my networks, and one of my early advisors who had moved away from Stanford by the time I was graduating, his dad was a professor actually at UCLA who was running HIV/AIDS training program that was this interdisciplinary program that involved people from sociology, psychology, social work, and public health that he was training as fellows. And he had a couple of postdoc positions, and I applied for one of them. And when I was interviewing with him, he said to me, "Let me put it this way, Eric, if you do HIV work, you'll never go home at the end of the day and think, what am I doing with my life?" And I thought, this guy's reading my mind. Because this is exactly the problem that I was having, was that I felt like what I was doing wasn't terribly meaningful, although intellectually it was fascinating because I was doing this very rich work about social networks, and we did a lot of work around axiomatic thinking about those models. And so I even had some professors that were interested in some computer simulation type theory development work within sociology. And so when I started working with Milland back in 2013, 2014, it was kind of a return to my 1990s sociology roots, because I had become this very applied social network researcher that worked on issues of HIV/AIDS with homeless youth in LA, and thought of myself, and still think of myself, as a very grounded researcher who knows young people who are experiencing homelessness by name, and they know me by name, and we have relationships with one another, and I understand what's happening in their lives and the rich context of the complexity of their lives, and their people are not, sort of, I don't know, people that I can drive into little agent models, which is the sort of stuff that I was doing as a graduate student. But when you start to work on AI modeling, having these very foundational, fundamental, almost axiomatic views of human behavior can be very useful when you are trying to create mathematical models of human behavior that you can then do computational experiments with to see what's going to happen, which is the sort of work that we got involved in. And so, like I said, I wasn't even sure that I was doing AI when I first started doing AI. It was a total shock to me. And then someday in the recent past, I woke up and realized that I ran an AI center called the Center for Artificial Intelligence and Society at USC. And I'm still somebody who's trained as a sociologist who is a social work scientist and thinks of himself as a social worker. And, I'm not quite sure how I got, how it is quite that I'm running an AI center, except that I know the series of events that led up to it. They just don't always make sense to me. So yeah, it's, sometimes in academia, things happen because you are pursuing things that feel exciting and interesting, or at least that's what happens in my life. I've been very fortunate to be somebody who has chased after things that I thought were interesting and been lucky enough that other people thought that they were cool too. So when I was in the 1990s, when I was a PhD student, I was really interested in social networks. And then by, the early part of the 2000s, by the time you get into, MySpace, Facebook days, by, 2006, 7, 8, kind of era, suddenly everybody's talking about social networks. And here I was sitting, kind of as a person who had been trained in thinking about network models and was very lucky. And I feel the same thing is true with the AI boom of the last few years. It's that I started doing this work with Milland because I thought it was really interesting, and I was chasing it because I thought it was cool. And then somewhere around 2017, 18, I kind of woke up and the world was really jazzed about AI, and it was AI this and AI that and AI this. And I thought, well, I'm sitting here doing this AI work. I guess I'm in the right place at the right time again, which is kind of cool. It's I don't think it's likely to happen a third time, but lightning in a bottle twice is pretty awesome. So yeah, and like I said, I think that my personal motivation for this work is really, aside from thinking about things that I think are intellectually interesting, it's really motivated by this passion that I have for social justice issues. That's really why I ended up in a school of social work and not in a sociology department, or not in a school of public health, although public health has a lot of concern about social justice, but not the way that social work does. Social work is inherently an area that is fundamentally concerned with social justice and addressing issues of social justice. And to be the kind of researcher that I am, who's interested in homelessness and HIV prevention and systemic racism and homophobia and these other issues, you know, you can sometimes in more traditional disciplines like sociology or psychology or economics, you know, I think you can sometimes become marginalized if you are working on issues that are about marginalized populations, because those are disciplines that are interested in explaining human behavior that is more the experience of most people, right? Whereas social work, because it was founded as a practice discipline that's trying to help address the causes and consequences of really urban poverty, I mean, it's really where it started in, you know, industrialization, that, you know, working on homelessness and systemic racism and disease prevention is exactly what social work does. You're not marginalized at all. You're in the middle of the pack, and that's a nice place to be, to have colleagues that also think that the work that you do is interesting and exciting. And
in your work, since you are doing AI for social good, people kind of label you as a researcher doing AI for social good. I'm wondering if you can maybe unpack what that is just at a high level, and then explain what that means for the research that you're doing specifically, or like right now.
I mean, I guess at a high level, what it means is that, well, first of all, I am not an AI, I'm not a computer scientist. So I partner with computer scientists like Phoebe Vianos and Bistra Delkina and Milland and Amelia Yadav and, you know, others who are computer scientists, and we collaborate on projects where we can use AI technologies and techniques to do some usually thing that has to do with intervention work, right? So social work as a discipline is very interested in intervening in the world and trying to address social injustice, not just observing it or cataloging it. And so AI can be very useful in a couple of ways. I mean, for one, you can use some techniques like machine learning to do data analysis when you're using big data sets and you're trying to do something like predictive analytics. You're trying to understand, what are the causes of a particular outcome, and can we do some data mining that's maybe a little bit more sophisticated than what you can do with linear statistics, which is what most social scientists are trained to do, right? Although honestly, I mean, one of the great laughs for me when I first got involved in AI work was that when it was explained to me that logistic regression was something that machine learning AI folks do, and that's the bread and butter of a social scientist when you're doing, sort of public health and social work type of work. And so what they were calling machine learning, I was just calling statistics. And so we realized that there was some more overlap than I think we understood. But the way that we think about data is a little bit different. They're more inclined to let the models tell them what is going on. Social scientists tend to have more a priori assumptions about what's happening in the world that they want to be testing as hypothesis testing, as opposed to more exploratory data mining, which is more what a computer scientist would do. But regardless, logistic regression is logistic regression, whether you let the computer decide what the variables you're going to keep are, or if you decide what the variables you're going to keep are. So part of what it means to me is that I'm a collaborator with computer scientists, and that we're trying to solve really thorny social problems like homelessness or systemic racism or HIV prevention. And we're trying to create new technologies to facilitate new solutions, right? And so one of the key projects that launched the center that I work on was an HIV prevention project. And so I was interested in designing a social network-based HIV prevention intervention. And one of the thorny issues there is that who delivers the messages about HIV prevention in a norm-changing, message-disseminating campaign is sometimes as important as the norm-changing messages themselves, right? So telling your friend to wear a condom when they have sex is not that challenging of a message to concoct. if I'm telling it to my friends, they're going to hear it better than if somebody who they care about less tells them that. So one of the things that was really a challenge for us when we were designing these programs was, how do we have a wide reach quickly so that with this very transient group of young people, we can get the message out really fast and we can find these key influencers. And what's really cool about the work that we did with the AI modeling that Milland Tambe and Amelia Yadav and Brian Wilder and particularly those three helped us design for this particular study, was that they were able to create these influence maximization algorithms that could really beat out any more static computational, oh, this is the person with the most connections sort of model. And when we did the field tests, it actually worked, right? Like, we actually found out that, when we did this field test with about 800 youth, that what we did was a study with 3 arms in it. One was just an observation, services rendered at the drop-in centers as usual. Another version of the study was a group of youth who were selected based on being the most popular people in the network. And then we used the algorithm that had been designed, that was an influence maximization algorithm, to actually select the people who would be trained as peer leaders who would disseminate these messages. And then we found out that, when we did this with about 800 youth, that in fact the AI-driven arm, not only do we have more young people reporting increases in condom use, especially around anal sex, but also that the changes happened faster, which for us was really important, because the idea is that you want these messages for homeless, youth who are experiencing homelessness that are very transient. You want them to happen really fast, because they're going to move. The friendships can break very quickly, and also some young people are going to leave your network because they're going to go to another city, or they're going to get housed, or they're going to go to jail. There's all kinds of reasons why young people leave the network, but they do. And so, that kind of work is really exciting. And so, and I guess serves as a good case study for what does it mean to do in practice, like an AI for social good, right? I think it's such an abstract concept that sometimes I think it's a little bit easier to say, oh, we had a very specific influence maximization computer algorithm that we built for this context that solved a particular intervention problem for us. And then we, as researchers, we tested out to see if that in fact worked. And so, they, as the computer scientists, did a lot of computational experiments using existing data that I had on youth networks. And then I, as a social work scientist, did actual boots on the ground training MSW interns to deliver the intervention. They delivered the intervention to, several hundred young people over a couple of years. And we were fortunate to find out that our efforts were rewarded, that this thing actually works, which is really cool. And, now we're doing the boring academic thing of like turning this into a manuscript and sending it off to a journal to be published. It's like, that's the, but you got to do that stuff, right? It's you'll never get tenure if you don't publish your stuff. You can't just do the fun stuff and then move on to the next fun thing. You got to prove that you did the good stuff.
So one question that I have, and I'm coming from a religious studies philosophy background in terms of my PhD, which probably means I'm about to ask an obnoxious question, and it's true, I am. Where I get caught in this conversation is that question of social good. And like, who gets to decide what the social good is? What are the metrics of social good? Especially if it's coming from the academy, which historically, maybe there have been some critiques about the academy not necessarily helping with the overall social good, depending on where you're sitting, right? Like, so for you, as you go to design these studies, like, how do you think about the question of social good and then where AI can participate in that conversation?
So, as a discipline, social work is very concerned with the ethics of doing social work and of the action of engaging in trying to address social injustice, right? So it is So I made the joke about what it's not good enough that I'm just a social work professor. I mean, because on some level, it's the guiding principles of social work that really direct the mission of social good. And in fact, when we were creating this research center, that I call CASE, so the Center for Artificial Intelligence and Society, CAIS, CASE. So if I refer to CASE, that's what I mean. So when we were building out CASE, we were looking to the grand challenges of social work, which are things like ending homeless. So grand challenges of social work, for those of you who are not in social work, is a series of 12 challenges that the National Academy of Social Work came up with a few years ago, that the idea was if there was movement made along any one of these 12 problems in the next decade in a meaningful way, that the world would be a better place for it. And there are things like ending homelessness, or addressing racial inequities, or healthy development for all youth. One of them is even very prosaic. It's technology, the promise of technology for social good, which I think falls into the very same trap that you're saying before. So, but most of the challenges have a little bit more content to them than the technology for social good one does. And so part of my thinking is that, this is the sort of thing that we use within the discipline to think about what is the work that we're doing to try to make the world a better place, and that those are the kinds of things that we think about. But interestingly, social work is a very pragmatic discipline as opposed to, say, religious studies or philosophy. So we're not necessarily arguing with, this is our definition of social good, this is how we are going to determine who determines what social good is. And we're a little bit more, we're going to do it and see how it goes, and we're going to try to do the best that we can. That's kind of the tradition of Jane Addams, which is not to say that it's thoughtless or that it's not intentional. It's very pragmatic. And so in that respect, we have these 12 challenges from social work that are these guiding sort of problem areas. And most of the work of my center, at least, falls under one of them. I mean, most of the stuff that we're doing is, we're doing work around health and well-being, around substance abuse. We're doing work around fairness, bias, and equity issues. We're doing work around homelessness. We're doing work around suicide prevention. Specifically, we've got a couple of projects. We're doing some work about the impact of global climate change. We've recently done some work looking at trying to help with COVID. One of the studies is actually around where could we allocate mobile testing sites so as to get to the most vulnerable individuals. And another study was trying to understand how to make fair decisions about how to allocate scarce resources in moments of crisis, like, say, experienced in Italy or in Florida, where you're running out of ICU beds and things like this, right? So how do you, what are the priorities of those systems to, who gets those resources and how might those things be done? And there's ways that, algorithmic thinking can help, come up with ideas for solving some of those problems, or ideas for querying. In the case of the preferences about who gets resources, it doesn't make the decision for you, but it's a series of algorithms that help you balance essentially comparisons of do you like choice A or choice B better, and it's an algorithm that helps you wind down the usually when you're thinking about making decisions that are complex, you have thousands of options, and it helps you narrow quickly by pairwise comparisons, with 6 or 7 key questions. What really is your preference? Is it for equity, or is it for efficiency, or is it for transparency? What do you really care about as the decision maker in this context? And if balancing those things quickly is something that you want to do, then we can help design tools that might assist that. But we're not trying to replace human judgment either with most of our tools. It's usually more the idea that we're trying to augment human decision-making processes. And I guess that's another piece of the AI for social good that my research center, being steeped in a school of social work and in engineering, so it's a 50-50 split at USC between social work and engineering. And because of that, social work we're really not interested in replacing human decisions with algorithms, but rather creating decision-making aids or automating parts of the decision-making process that are very burdensome for people that people don't actually like. I mean, people don't like to schedule things, right? But whereas computer algorithms are very happy to schedule things for you. The computer, an AI will not complain about the drudgery of scheduling. It just does it. So it's anyway. Not sure if that helps, but that's the wanderings of my mind this afternoon. So there you go.
No, definitely. And Eric, I'm pretty curious what your view is on the potentially negative thoughts towards some of the work that you're doing. So I'm specifically referring to the solutionism trap, which was introduced by Andrew Selbst and others in a paper a few years ago, and then also the term techno-chauvinism, which is all kind of saying that it's this concept that some people think that technology is the best solution to some of the hardest problems in society, for better or for worse. And I'm curious if anyone's approached you with these terms or similar terms and critiqued your work in that way, and what your response might be to that.
I hope that the podcast conveys my sense of humor about these things. So a lot of the times I think, wow, you're talking to the wrong dude. Like, I still write things down with a pen and a notebook. And if we were in a different room, I could show you that I've got a shelf with like a couple thousand LPs on it. I'm a very analog, kind of Luddite sort of guy. I don't actually think that technology for technology's sake is a good thing. It's more that I am interested in solving thorny problems, and I'm interested in thinking about things in novel ways, because I think if you imagine a problem like homelessness, right? If it were something that a particular discipline could solve easily, then we would have solved it. If all we needed was a bunch of really smart economists or a bunch of really smart social workers, then we'd be done. But we're not. We're mired, And so I think that bringing people together that think about the world in very different ways, which it turns out, shock of shocks, social workers and computer scientists think about the world differently. Interestingly, they also think about the world similarly, which is kind of a funny thing, because engineers and social workers are both very pragmatic oriented folks, but our training is very, very different. I took like 5 semesters of college calculus, but most social work professors did not. Most of us probably tapped out at that first semester when, your general ed requirement was done and haven't thought about, partial derivatives ever since, and are happy that that's the way that their life is. And, whereas, obviously, if you're a computer scientist, and you're watching this podcast, you guys talk about, proving theorems all the time, right? There are likely some social work scientists that have, maybe not proven a math theorem since like high school geometry, if maybe then, but disciplinary training aside, those differences in perspectives about how to think about and problematize things can be very important, because when people that are smart and are thoughtful about their specific training, their specific disciplines, get together and start asking each other what's going on to the other one, we end up asking each other really fundamental, really hard questions, right? Like, we ask the sorts of questions that like Dylan and you are asking me, like, is it even okay to do this stuff, right? So, so they'll ask me, usually because they're computer scientists, they don't ask me, is it okay to do stuff? Like, computer scientists like to do stuff. But they will ask me things like, how do you know that this aspect of human behavior happens in this way? And so then I find myself having to really dig down into, what are the assumptions of human behavior that are underlying this? What is the research that backs this up? And, and vice versa. When I'm wanting to know what they're doing, I will ask them probably what seems like very foundational questions about how these algorithms work. And so I think we've all become much more in touch with, we have to know our stuff a lot better, because we have to explain it to people that are not trained with all of the techno babble that we all get trained in as academics. But I don't know if I'm even answering the question at this point. I mean, I feel I'm not trying to dodge the question about, do people give you a hard time about this? I mean, every once in a while, yeah, people give me a hard time about, like, you're trying to create algorithms to solve social problems, and shouldn't that be something that is about human judgment? And some of my answers are yes, of course. We're not trying to replace humans. We're trying to create tools that will augment the work of humans, not replace humans. Are we fetishizing technology? Maybe. I mean, even though I myself, tend to like, notebooks and albums, it's I mean, look, it's I still am a guy who, design, I'm doing a project on addressing systemic racism around homelessness, and we're designing algorithms to do it, right? Certainly, there's been criticisms about using algorithms that have generated and perpetuated systemic racism, right? Especially in the context of, say, the justice, the space of like bail sentencing, right? I mean, bail bonds sentencing, and I don't know if I'm saying that right. I'm probably not, but I mean, there was sort of a very famous case that I think it was reported on in about 2016, 17, where there had been an automated system based on a machine learning algorithm that was essentially, if you were Black, your chances of getting a bail were radically less than if you had the exact same set of offenses, but you were white. And so there was all these problems, about racial inequality that were being essentially perpetuated by ML. And frankly, that can happen, right? I mean, we were looking at this in the context of this study that I'm doing, where we're trying to address systemic racism in the context of the Housing Service Authority in LA. If you look at the data that we've got on existing housing resources, and you use the existing scoring tool, which is kind of a paper pencil algorithm, right? It's not there are some problems about racial equity in outcomes that you can observe in the data in that in some of the data sets that we have from we've got a 16 city data set of youth from across the country, and we can see there that African-American youth in particular are not doing as well in the outcomes of their placements. If you do an ML approach and you just try to maximize the efficiency of the outcomes based on trying to maximize who's going to get who you can actually exacerbate the already bad race inequalities can become even worse if you just do like just a out of the box decision tree or a logistic regression sort of ML thing. But if you then you do some clever algorithm design and try to impose constraints that insist upon fair distributions, you can actually rectify the situation. You can actually generate allocation algorithms and tools that actually are fair and unbiased with respect to race. So you can use technology poorly and you can use technology well, right? And I think part of what makes the work that I've been involved in potentially powerful in a good way is that by bringing together people like myself whose background is in social work and we're really steeped in the context, we're really thinking about what are the problems to be alerted to. And so, we're asking things like, is there racial bias in these data that we need to maybe solve for, as opposed to let run rampant. Not to say that computer scientists can't be thoughtful, but I mean, I've spent 20 years thinking about homelessness and almost 20 years thinking about homelessness and what the issues that we need to be thinking about in that context are, and I can bring a lot to the table, to a modeler for whom, you know, they may have been thinking about homelessness for a few months, or, you know, at this point, you know, they've been, you know, like Phoebe, who's working on this particular project with me at USC, Phoebe Vianos, I mean, she's been thinking about it since about 2017. So it's, you know, a few years, but still, you know, I still think that, you know, I mean, I've become better about computer science. She's become better about social work. We learn a lot from each other. I mean, it's kind of the fun. It's part of the fun. I mean, you know, I think this is the other thing that I think sometimes gets lost in academia is that people are not always very joyful. You know, I think that it's a, you know, it can be such a terribly serious business. Like, we all take ourselves so freaking seriously. It's like, and you know, and sure, you know, homelessness is a serious issue, right? Like, I take it serious. I just don't take myself that seriously. And I think that, you know, a little, you know, and one of the things that's cool about this sort of the AI for social good, at least the way that I've concocted it, where it's these collaborations, you know, we have fun. You know, we get together and we work on things that are different from what most people in our respective disciplines are working on, and we try to, you know, keep a sense of humor about the fact that some of our colleagues are going to look at us like we're from Mars, and like that's going to happen, and that's okay, and also that, you know, and to try to, you know, enjoy the some of the confusions that we create when we realize, I mean, because, you know, it is challenging to learn to talk to computer scientists when you don't have a computer science background. And it's challenging, I'm sure, to talk to a social scientist when you don't have a social scientist background. I mean, we all learn these very, very specific, very jargon-filled languages, and we've got all these, you know, shortcuts that we speak in. You know, I mean, the 3-letter acronyms alone are enough to drive a person crazy, right? You know, so it's yeah. Anyway.
So on that, Eric, I'm really caught by this idea of joy, and then also it sounds like some level of like curiosity in this interdisciplinary space. But I'm curious if you, I guess the other thing that's stuck with me through this entire interview is when you started talking about how you got into this work and the population that you work with, especially homeless youth, and that concept of knowing the names of the people that you work with and them knowing your name. And I'm wondering if there's any sort of, in terms of that like personal connection, if there's any sort of like story or memory that you have of this work that is particularly staying with you that reminds you of that joy and that curiosity.
I mean, there's a lot. I mean, it kind of depends on which piece of this I'm thinking about. But I mean, I guess. Yeah, I mean, so one story that sticks out is sort of the way in which algorithms can be smart in ways that sometimes social workers even are not. So one of my favorite stories to tell is about this one young man who, when we were doing the HIV prevention intervention, I had done an HIV prevention intervention a couple years previous, and had done sort of a typical public health thing, which is, you know, if you don't pick the most popular youth, you sort of hand pick young people that you think will be good at this work, which usually means that they're sort of pro-social in some sort of way that seems like they're, you know, adhering to kind of norms of sort of mainstream society and adulthood, right? And it turns out that that's not always the best set of decisions to make. You know, and what we found when we did this one algorithm was that, you know, algorithms will sometimes pick people that are unlikely candidates, right? So the algorithm picked this one guy who, well, I'll call him Jeff. That's not his real name, but so Jeff, right? And so Jeff got pulled by the algorithm, and I hadn't seen Jeff for a few days at the drop-in center. It was coming up time. We needed him to show up for this training that we were going to do on Friday. It was a Wednesday afternoon, so I decided to go. The drop-in center was by the beach, Venice Beach. So I went down to the Venice Beach boardwalk, and I went up headed toward the skate park and looking for this guy because he hangs out this is sort of one of the areas that he hangs out in, I was told. And I see him on this grassy area that's just before you get to the beach proper. And he's kind of on this hilly area with some palm trees, with a couple of his buddies. And he is literally passing a joint with his friends, right, as I walk up. Because, I mean, this is California, right? Like, you can get away with this kind of thing. And as I walk up to him, I think, great, this is gonna go. This is just, I mean, so I say to him like, hey Jeff, what's going on? He's like, hey dude, what's up? I'm like, all right, hey man, so remember that study you signed up for, and we said that a computer program might pick you, to potentially be trained to be a peer leader. Yeah, oh yeah. So it picked you. Oh, sweet, dude. I was like, so do you want to do that? Oh yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, is this guy even going to remember this conversation? I mean, he's not drunk, so probably he's going to remember it, but is he going to care? So I said to him, all right, man, like, look, the training is going to be on Friday morning. It's day after tomorrow. It's going to be at the drop-in center. It's going to be at 9 a.m. So, you can you be there? And he's like, oh yeah, dude. Yeah, for sure. And I'm thinking to myself, no way. This guy's not his action. So I show up about 1:45 to set things up. I get out of my car. I've got a whole bunch of stuff that I'm staggering on my car with. There's Jeff on his skateboard, sitting in front of the gate, cup of coffee in his hand. Hey, Eric, can I help you get stuff out of your, help you unload stuff from your car? And he went on to be like one of the best peer leaders we trained, right? So me as a, despite the long hair, sort of square academic who's going to be like, whatever, this guy's not going to show up. It turns out that, I'm wrong, right? It's that, the algorithm knew this is a guy who's connected. And it turns out that all he needed was somebody, in this case, a computer program, to see him and say, you're important, man. Do you want to be a part of change in your community? And his answer was, yes, I do. And he was all in. And like, that's a really cool reminder that sometimes, even our best intentions can go a little bit funny, and sometimes the solutions that we create are more impactful than we even realize they're going to be, right? And so this program, one of the things that was kind of cool about it, I kind of joke about it, was sort of like the Breakfast Club versus the high school football team. So this is dating myself, right? So yes, I was a teenager in the 80s. So there was this movie, if you haven't seen it, you can look it up on IMDb, called The Breakfast Club. And in this movie, there's this group of these 5 kids that are spending all day detention. It's like a jock, a stoner, a nerd, a goth, and I guess a princess. And so these kids from these different social cliques, they all come together, they become friends for the day, and then at the end of the day, they kind of all go their separate ways again. And that's kind of the dynamics that we had with this algorithm. Like, it brought in all of these young people from these different social cliques. We trained them up to be our outreach workers, and then they went back out into the world. And that's what the algorithm was pulling for, was people that were important to these specific little communities. Whereas when we did the popularity version, which was like the way that public health has thought you should do this for the last 20 years, what happened was we basically got what felt like the high school football team. In this case, it was like some skater bros. But basically what it was a bunch of guys that knew each other, and they had some hangers on to their clique. But the information doesn't really spread outside of that core group very fast, and they brought all of their nonsense with them, right? So it was, the trainings with that group were just so hard, because they just were, they're just all over the place, because there's all this like sort of jockeying for their internal status hierarchies that was going on. Whereas, when we had our little breakfast club, they're just, they were there with the mission. It was so cool. And so, algorithms do really cool things. And so I think about some of those kind of anecdotes about, why do I do this work and how does it work? And honestly, it's amazing to see people thrive, right? Like, another one of these young people, who was one of the early peer leaders in this thing, I ran into him on Venice Beach about a month or so before COVID started. I just happened to be walking down the street, and I ran into this guy, and he was currently working 2 jobs. He was stable. His life had turned around, and it was really cool. He was like, your program was one of the first things that, I got to do that really gave me a sense of purpose and meaning again, when I was experiencing homelessness. And it was so cool to be a part of that. And it was one of the things that helped. It wasn't the only thing for this guy, but it was one of the things that was part of his story that turned things around. And, and that's a really, that's a really rewarding experience to have happen. It doesn't happen all the time, right? I mean, I can end up on Venice Beach and not run into any of these folks many times, but every once in a while, and then it's a nice reminder that, and that's, I think, some of the joy of it. So I think AI for social good can actually be a very human experience. Especially if you go to the level where you actually implement some of these solutions in the real world, and not just kind of do them as hypothetical desk exercises.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. I think it's a really good symbol of how meaningful this work seems that it can be. And kind of switching directions a little bit here as we near towards the latter half of the interview. As you know, Eric, you're on the Radical AI podcast, and we were briefly mentioning this earlier to kind of foreshadow the question that we ask all of our guests, which is to ask you how you define the word radical, and if you situate the work that you're doing within the radical AI definition that you have.
Well, I did mention that I was a teenager in the 80s, right? So I mean, so radical is something that as soon as you say, what does radical mean? It's like a slang for it's cool. But no, I do think of what we do as radical. I think I've always been a fan of the line of social work that's part of the Saul Alinsky community organizing rule. He has this great book, Rules for Radicals, and while he's not a social worker in a traditional sense, he's certainly somebody that social workers read and point to as a social work itself is a pretty radical discipline in the sense that if you think about radical as being on the sort of more extreme side of the left of the political spectrum, right? I mean, this is a and for me, the AI that we do is very much about social justice. So it's about trying to make, if we're lucky, radical change that we can have, and that AI could help facilitate that. Now, probably the best example of that is this project that we're doing with systemic racism, right? I mean, so we understand that housing insecurity, homelessness is something that happens, especially for Black Americans, in ways that are deeply tied into the 400-year history going back to the first Africans brought over as slaves, and a series of laws. I mean, one of my PhD students who just graduated, Dr. China Hill, she has a chapter in her dissertation, if you go look it up online, that is about she calls it the algorithm of Black homelessness, and she uses that as a essentially like a play on words, but also as a way of thinking about the fact that there has been a systematic series of policies and laws that have created disparate outcomes for Black Americans who experience homelessness. And so we're trying to design algorithms that could be used to combat that long history of systemic racism. That's a pretty radical idea. I mean, if you think about systemic racism and the protests that are happening in the streets around Black Lives Matter, I mean, some academics designing some algorithms is not the same as thousands of people, marching in the streets. But we are interested in trying to change and address systemic racism with that project. That is absolutely one of the goals of this work. And it's kind of an interesting moment in time that I feel that I'm even allowed to, within the academy, say that I have a project that is about addressing systemic racism, and that people, understand what that means more so than they used to, which is pretty amazing. And B, that I'm allowed to do that, and I keep my job. I mean, I guess that's one of the benefits of having tenure, right? Is that it's freedom of speech. But I mean, it's important it is important when addressing issues of social justice and social injustice to be plain and direct, and not to obfuscate the truth, right? I mean, if what we're talking about around homelessness is that there's issues of systemic racism in the history of America that have led to inequalities for Black Americans around homelessness, this is something that should be talked about. because it's not going to be fixed if we don't address it. Just by talking about it's not going to fix it. We have to actually design new systems. We have to create new laws. We have to create new policies. These algorithms could potentially be tools that could be implemented in such systems. But the dialogue is a part of it as well, right? And it's radical, dude.
As we look towards closing out the interview, we like to ask pieces of advice from our guests, and I'm curious for you. So we have a lot of folks that listen to the show who are really struggling with how heavy these topics can be and struggling to find hope and joy in this. And I'm wondering, for maybe if you have like a colleague in mind or someone who's working in industry or a student maybe, like what would you say as a piece of advice to them to help them reconnect with that joy?
Sure. I mean, I think I've always been a fan of Viktor Frankl. He has this, he's an existential psychologist. He has this book called Man's Search for Meaning. And in that, one of the ideas is that part of what human beings are striving for is a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives. This is one of the sort of fundamental things that we need to do as humans is find meaning. And I think that resonates for me. And I think part of my joy in this, like when I tell stories about these young men, who experience homelessness, or the young women who've experienced homelessness that I've known in my past, I try to focus in on the wins, the successes. And I also realize that working toward social justice, working on problems that are difficult, provides a sense of meaning and purpose in one's life. And I think that there is joy to be derived from living a meaningful life. It's maybe not a dopamine high kind of joy. I mean, it's more of a contentment sort of joy, right? It's more of a, not to be too spiritual, says the hippie, but I mean, I think that it's the kind of looking, it's a joy in knowing that you're walking a path that you are in harmony with other people, and that you're in harmony with the world, and that you're trying to be a part of solutions, and that all of that certainly feels good. And I think that, but it can also be overwhelming at times to work on issues of social justice and social injustice. And it's the sort of thing that, can easily bring one to, tears of frustration as well as tears of joy if you really think about these things deeply. And that's okay though, and I think sometimes in American culture and society, we're always kind of looking for a quick fix happy. I think this is part of why we have, some of the world's worst rates of substance abuse and et cetera, is that we're always, we're looking for these quick highs, these quick fixes. We're not necessarily willing to put in the work and wanting to think about, what is the long-term, joys, the engagements that, come through a sense of meaning and purpose. And I think that's a life where you work on problems of social injustice, in my experience, is one that is very joyful in having meaning, in having friendships, in having colleagues that you can work sort of hand in hand with. I think that the competitive aspect of academia is really less in these spaces where social justice is so prevalent, because the concern to do the right thing sometimes is more important than who gets to be first author, or who's getting another grant, or who got published where. And that's nice, because really, if there are some homeless youth whose lives are made better because of the work that I do, that's awesome. If I publish another paper that's in a journal, I don't know that matters that much, I mean, and that isn't always the most popular thing to say as a professor, right? I'm supposed to say it's really important to publish and win grants because those are the markers of success and achievement in the academy. And it's like, yeah, those things are good. Those things are important. Those things are good for career advancement. But, those things may not unto themselves bring you a sense of purpose and joy in your life. And, this is it, guys. Like, this is the human experience as we know it. I mean, if there is something else after this, like, we don't know what it is exactly. So, be here and be as present in this here as you can is my thoughts about it. But then I'm devolving into being a hippie again. So.
No, Eric, thank you so much for that healthy dose of perspective, especially coming from fellow academics. And thank you for sharing advice about joy and the meaningful quality of your work. So thanks for coming on the show. It's really been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I wish you all the best with this and keep pushing for more radical AI. I think it's a great thing to be doing. So it's been my pleasure.
We want to thank Eric Rice again for joining us today for this wonderful conversation. And my first reaction to this interview was a bit of conflict, actually. And this is something that I've felt a lot when it comes to AI for social good initiatives, because on the one hand, I see so much potential for amazing results, and I see so much potential for really meaningful work, like Eric was explaining through his firsthand experiences. And then I also read papers and I see different talks that are being given by people like Dworak-Peck, who are explaining some of the potential harms of things like techno-solutionism and techno-chauvinism and people who think that technology can be the solution for everything. And I don't think Eric is one of those people. And I think that he is actually a good example of less harmful ways to implement AI for social good. But I do think that it is a fine line that we have to balance. And we have to ask ourselves, when can we leverage AI for different ways of solving societal problems, and when are we maybe exploiting technology for things that could be more harmful rather than beneficial when we place them out into society and just hope that they might be able to solve something that they have no place in solving in the first place.
I think, and I know we're probably getting close to time here, but one thing I just want to throw into the mix is the role of ego in all of this. And like this enlightenment ego, especially of like, well, we can fix it. We can fix it all. Like I have the power. Like I'm going to make nature bend to my command. I'm going to make the social structure bend to my command through this like technology as a tool. And I think Eric's work is a really good, especially like I'm just so touched by his stories of like how he knows everyone he works with, right, or most of the people he work with, like on a first name basis, is just like incredible to me because I realize how little that can happen in research spaces. And so that question of humility, but also like as researchers, as scientists, as people dealing with technology and designing technology, like how do we treat our own ego? And is it possible that sometimes that ego grows a little bit larger than the task that we're trying to complete or the problem that we're trying to solve? But I think that's all I can say for right now. But for more information on today's show, please visit the episode page at radicalai.org.
If you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher. Catch next week's episode on Wednesday, and join our conversation on Twitter at RadicalAIPod. As always, stay radical.